Video games based on licensed media properties have a very dubious reputation. They're usually associated with low-effort, poor-quality games pumped out by opportunistic publishers, ignorant rights holders, and unprepared, overworked, or outright fly-by-night development studios, in order to make a quick buck at the expense of consumers shopping on the basis of brand recognition. But, as with any general rule, there are always exceptions. Being one of the most prolific creators, holders, and manipulators of intellectual property, the Walt Disney Company has had a more careful and generally positive run of video games based on its franchises. This appears to have been because Disney actually paid attention to who it had make games for them. It went directly to the big names and well-established companies in the business. In fact, Nintendo was the first company to make a video game product with Disney's properties, when it produced some of its earliest Game & Watch units using Mickey Mouse. Something only Nintendo was in the position to do, since it had a pre-existing relationship with Disney for manufacturing playing cards with Disney characters in Japan. One of the company's earliest marketing coups long before it got into video games. But Nintendo aside, Disney also partnered with big players like Atari, Capcom, and Sega, often more than once. While they pumped out so many games that some of them were certainly more on the forgettable side, they also had some real gems and hits on their hands as well, with the very well-regarded DuckTales on the NES from Capcom, the Castle of Illusion platformer from Sega, as well as the Aladdin games on the Genesis and Super Nintendo, one made by Sega, the other by Capcom, as well as the technically impressive Mickey Mania developed by Traveler's Tales. Technically, Disney had its own internal studio, Disney Interactive, but this subsidiary usually just played the role of producer and contracted the actual work of making the games to more experienced third-party studios. Since Disney had so many properties under its belt, it didn't just wholesale hand over the keys to its kingdom to any one company, but instead contracted the rights to different characters and movies to different companies. At the exact same time Disney was inking a deal with Nintendo for a whopping 13 games on the Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color, it signed a separate deal with a new, up-and-coming studio that showed a lot of promise for bringing some of its characters to life. That company was Ubisoft. Ubisoft was a French company that had reached the point of becoming the largest distributor of video games in that country by 1993, and hit it big in 1995 as a developer of video games with its 2D platformer, Rayman. From there, it began a very steady and meteoric rise in the industry as a major publisher. Looking at the incredibly high-quality 2D animation in Rayman, it made a lot of sense that a company like Disney would see them as a viable partner for translating some of its characters into video games. So during that summer of 1999, around the same time as E3, Disney inked a deal with Ubisoft to produce some games based off of Donald Duck, a privilege that last rested with Sega. In fact, Disney Interactive was reportedly very impressed with the lush graphical representation of the upcoming Rayman 2, which was good since that game's engine would serve as the basis for one of these Donald Duck games. But by the late 90s, Ubisoft was very busy expanding and opening new studios all around the world. Being a French company, when it looked to establish a footprint in the North American market, there was one place that made a lot of natural sense: the biggest outpost of French language and culture on the continent, Quebec. This convenient bit of cross-continental cultural connection also coincided with a political incentive from the local ruling Parti Québécois to make up for the loss of manufacturing and textile industries in the wake of free trade reorganization brought on by NAFTA. This led to a deal for the Canadian and Quebec governments to subsidize the first 25,000 Canadian dollars of employee wages for the first 5 years of Ubisoft's latest branch, when it established Ubisoft Montreal in 1997. This studio would be a brand new ground floor operation, as it was stood up with 50 new employees, half of which would come over from Ubisoft France, and the other half were newly hired on with no prior experience in the industry. Ubisoft Montreal started out slowly and carefully, focusing on licensed properties like Playmobil toys, with the surprisingly well-received Hype the Time Quest, as well as the racing title Speed Busters, brought over to the Dreamcast as Speed Devils. they attempted a wholly new intellectual property with Tonic Trouble, conceived by Rayman creator Michel Ancel. But this game was less favorably received compared to Rayman 2, which promptly knocked it off Ubisoft and gamers' radar. So it was back to the licensed games mines for Ubisoft Montreal. And it just so happened, Ubisoft had a new Disney deal in hand for them to work on. While a different Ubisoft studio was tasked with developing a Donald Duck game for the PC, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast, and yet another internal studio was working on a version for the original PlayStation, Ubisoft Montreal would get the bigger task of making a Donald Duck game for the PlayStation 2. This would actually land right after the PS2 launch in November of 2000, when Donald Duck Goin Quackers hit that system, and that is the game that was ported very directly over to the GameCube in March of 2002. Now, each of these versions were just different iterations of the same game. Don't let me create the impression that they were each developing different games. And the fact they used the Rayman 2 engine as the basis for the game also ensured they had an incredibly solid and visually impressive technical platform to work off of. Still, considering each of these studios, Ubisoft Montreal, Ubisoft Casablanca, and Ubisoft Shanghai were literally working from 3 different continents, it's rather remarkable that each of these versions don't feature more differences from one another. Being a relatively new studio starting out at developing a reputation for making games and playing it safe, they didn't break any new ground, and the final product is very often and rightfully compared to Crash Bandicoot. But these are great games, so if you're going to copy from somewhere, it's a good place to take inspiration from. So what's that look like here? As with any game we cover, and particularly with an animated franchise like Donald Duck, you get an animated CG intro movie. It's not terribly high-quality animation, very representative of the late 90s, early 2000s uncanny valley character models and untextured environments, but this is also a cartoon world, so it gets away with it for the most part. Anyway, the strange story here involves Daisy Duck as a reporter being captured by a mad villain scientist who is working on something. Given that his lady friend is captured, Donald Duck then sets out on his adventure to rescue her. To do this, he'll need to stand up radio towers so his friend's teleportation device will have enough power to send him to the villain's lair. You get started at your warp room of warp rooms that'll take you to the launch pad for each individual world. From each world, you can then choose to hop into one of the individual levels and be on your way. Being the first level in a children's game, you're hit with a barrage of long text explaining how to play and each of the game mechanics. They're of course pretty simple. You run, you jump, you can double jump, and you have an attack. You pick up little mechanical gears as your collectible items. You can open presents to either restore one of your hit points or power up your character temporarily. Speaking of hit points, you have approximately 2. If you get hit by an enemy once, you go into Angry Donald mode, a rage mode that functions as a temporary invincibility period. If you take another hit after this, you die and lose a life. If you pick up a milkshake, then you're restored back to normal and you have your 1 hit point back. Of course, falling off the edge of the level or into a pit, you just die immediately. Now, as we mentioned earlier, this game is clearly modeled on Crash Bandicoot. The levels are certainly rendered in polygonal 3D, but they take place on virtually 2-dimensional playfields, either in horizontal or vertical layouts. You just need to make your way to the end of each level and reach the goal. This inspiration is taken a step further, as there are also levels where you're being chased down the screen by a big, undefeatable enemy character that you just need to outrun to the end. There is a new and additional mechanic that gets explained to you early on. If you collect 5 of the collectible cogs in a short period of time, you get 1 letter in the word special. If you collect them all, then Donald's nephews will bestow on you a special move that you can execute in the levels when you stomp on the heads of 3 consecutive enemies without touching the ground. This special move involves you pulling off a button combination after landing your 3rd jump on an enemy. I'll be perfectly honest. After practicing this a little bit in the practice space you get in between levels, I was not particularly interested in pulling off these special moves in the levels themselves. The levels are easy and manageable enough without them, and pulling off these combinations can be a little tricky when the directionals are involved and you're already in the air. That addition to the formula aside, everything else is pretty standard and straightforward, and that's not a knock on it. I personally love the Crash Bandicoot games. Crash Bandicoot 2 was my first video game, so I have an evident bias towards these kinds of games, and this is a good one. It's a very solid, competently made platformer. The level designs are well balanced and manageable, never appearing unfair or too crazy. The part that actually did measure up to some degree of difficulty was the boss battles. With some well thought out attack patterns and clever use of stage mechanics, I was actually pleasantly surprised with these stages. And that's about it. There's not much else to be said here. It's a very solid, no-frills platformer. Platforming stages, chase stages, boss stages, and collectibles. Rinse and repeat till you finish it off. In the Pac-Man World 2 episode, I said that game might make a good example for an introductory platformer for a new player. Now that might be applicable for a more open 3D platforming game, but for the simplest of platformers, this is probably an excellent bet. And that fits. It's a Disney game. It's a game made with kids as the primary audience in mind. It does a solid job at that. Unspectacular for anyone else familiar with more prolific platformers, but a good starting point for a new studio just trying to get experience under its belt. Maybe we'll see bigger things from them down the road.